Where you can't use where you're talking about what we talked about earlier with like a lot of the simpler images, the pings and the GIFs and stuff, and we mentioned briefly the SVG. SVG stuff is a great option in terms of what that's going to do. It's low weight. It scales to these different resolutions. It scales to different sizes. It does it sharp because it's a vector format. You can compress the heck out of that sucker with gzip and everything else because it's just text. There's a lot of benefits for SVG. Now the trade-off is that you have to deal around some support issues. Android 2.x, which is still the second most popular version, and it was the most popular version of the operating system until just recently. But Android 2.x is still the second most popular version of the operating system. It doesn't support SVG. Older versions of IE, same thing. They don't support it. There are ways around that. One of the kind of the inelegant, but it gets the job done sort of ways that I'm seeing in some sites is this idea of that you load the SVG image as the source, and then you just use the onError attribute to load in a ping that would replace it. It looks ugly. It breaks the preloader issues there as well. But it does get the job done in terms of getting something that works on those older devices. There's more elegant ways to get around it, but this is one of the methods people use. You can also do some sort of a stacking fallback thing. Like sometimes they'll use an object element with an SVG, and then you use like a background image to kind of swap out if that SVG isn't supported. So a lot of logos. That's one approach that people are using there. For CSS, you can do something simple with Modernizer or any other sort of feature detection library. Just add a SVG or no SVG class, depending on support to the body or the HTML element, and then just swap out what background image gets used. And we'll get a little bit into the background images in a second in terms of how to avoid the double downloads and things like that. So the basic gist for responsive images is that there are a few things to do when you're kind of looking at this. The first thing is to analyze. So take a look at your site, take a look at the design, take a look at the different images that are in play. You need to find out a bunch of things. You need to find out what the source is, like where do those images come from, who updates the images, how does that get placed into a CMS, what are the CMS's capabilities in terms of resizing or spitting out if you want different images with art direction, do you have that capability? Not all images need to be responsive in terms of different sizes. Sometimes you have an image that displays in a 3-column grid on the large screen, so it's about 300 pixels, and it stays at about 300 pixels no matter where you size it. Sometimes at the moment at least, if it's within a certain amount of pixel range, you may find it's best just to let it be that original size and not deal with trying to find some sort of hack to put in place to get around that. Also, you can't necessarily apply the exact same solution, the exact same formula to every image on your site. Some images will be larger on a small screen and smaller on a large screen because of the way they're displayed in the design, which means that you can't necessarily just pull that out and apply the exact same approach from page to page and image to image. So do this kind of analysis to find out what images actually would benefit from it and put the solution in place there. And also do some analysis of the workflow and the process to determine what solution is going to best fit. Analyze, hit those big images first. This gets back to that pixel thing we were talking about, where you take the 50 pixel scale, so a small scale for a 600 pixel image, 57,500 wasted pixels. The same 50 pixel descaling at like a 200 pixel size image is significantly less sitting there in memory. So if you're only going to hit some things, hit those big images and knock those things out of the park. Because you're talking about a 3.2x in this time, 3.2 time difference in terms of optimizing the large image for 50 pixels versus the small image. So really focus on finding a solution for those things. Those tend to be the biggest issues. And then know the trade-offs, because there's always going to be a trade-off in terms of workflow, in terms of preloader versus weight. At the moment, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. There's nothing that I can say, here, just do this, and you will always have it. Sometimes it's a multi-stepped process. It can be, the images get uploaded into the CMS, they get compressed, they get resized to different sizes, and then they get spit out onto an include or something like that you have. That's one thing with the responsive images. Try to keep that image modular, like that little thing is a separate include or a separate module, because a year or 2 years later, when we finally figure this thing out, you're going to hate yourself if you have to go through and update a whole bunch of spans that are sitting around in your content everywhere. So try to have that image thing as its own include so that when you find a solution that works, you can just swap that out. But this is the big one. This is if you do nothing else after this presentation, if nothing else is of any value, hopefully there's something from the responsive images thing that you can at least go back and do something about that, because that's such a big deal. Background images, not so sucky actually. This we can actually do something around. I tested a whole bunch of, I think there's 9 different variations of the test I did for how a browser downloads background images when media queries are involved. And there's a couple ways that it actually works. So you avoid the double downloads. If you hide the parent container, so if you have the background image applied on that inner div and you hide the parent, the image doesn't get downloaded. Now, if you put the display none on the actual element that has the background image, it's still going to get requested. But when you actually apply it to the parent, you no longer have to deal with that. I think actually if anybody was in Jake's session this morning, I'm guessing he went over that. I think he did last time I saw that. So that's one way around it. If they're within media queries, so if you don't have a background image specified in your core base styles, and then you only apply them within the media queries, you also avoid the double download penalty. But if you have it outside of the media queries, you're still going to get downloads on a lot of browsers. The double download thing is another very common issue with responsive sites. The serving too much, serving things that were meant to never be shown, and then serving things twice happens quite a bit. But thankfully, background images are a fairly easy one for us to crack. This one's been kind of solved. And the same thing works for resolution and everything like that. It's not too bad to work around once you know the constraints that you're playing within. Another big optimization for responsive sites, because we are changing how things display and what actually should show up at different screen sizes, to conditionally load where it makes sense. The catch here, of course, because there's always a catch, the catch here is that you want to be careful on the mobile networks where you have that high cost to be able to make that initial connection to a mobile network. Because if you're conditionally loading, you're lazy loading a bunch of stuff and you're not careful about how you're doing that, you could continually reopen that connection, which zaps battery and it also slows things down. It's just not a very good idea. So you do need to be careful when you're doing the lazy loading, conditional loading thing, that you're either doing it in batches that are very smartly done, or it's something that has a very low likelihood of being displayed, things like that. You don't want to just use it for everything. There are some sites that do the images all the way down the page, and as you scroll through the page, those images keep getting requested as you go down. That's a surefire way to kill the battery. It looks fantastic on your page weights, your initial page weight, and your initial onload values, but the actual impact is not very good. What I like here is I like the Guardian's way of kind of looking at this stuff. So they did a responsive site they're working on. It's in alpha or beta, I think, at the moment. They put performance kind of in the front. This was a big deal for them. This was a big driver. And they looked at it from 3 ways. They organized their content as being content. This is the core stuff, the HTML and things like that. The enhancements being the CSS and the little bit of JavaScript enhancements and things the additional candy that gets layered on top. And then the leftovers. So these are the things that the user doesn't care about. Depending on your company and what your ways of making money are and things like that, this could be ads and things like that. I think that's how they classified their ads, fell under the leftovers. Now, based on this, they prioritized what got downloaded and how. They made sure that that content got there immediately and that the enhancements got layered on top shortly after, so that you had that initial render happen very quickly, and then the leftovers kind of trickled in after the fact. This involves a business decision, because you're deciding that these ads might come in later. You're deciding that maybe your analytics come in a little later, which has trade-offs in terms of some people, maybe they don't hit those. So that's a business decision that has to be made. In their case, they analyzed it from that perspective and found that this was the way to go. The BBC does something they call cutting the mustard, which I think is a fantastic approach both for performance and extending the reach of a site. What they do is they have this simplified core experience where there's nothing really to it. There's very few images, there's no JavaScript enhancements, everything's basic. And then using these 3 lines of JavaScript, they check to see if the query selector is available in document, local storage in window, and add event listener in window. If those things are present, they determine that it's a modern browser that's going to get their enhanced experience, and then they load in the additional JavaScript, they load in the additional CSS, they load in the additional images. Now, why they made these 3 is because add event listener and query selector are big reasons for why you might use like a JavaScript framework. So in their case, if they found that those things were present, they probably didn't need to load like jQuery or things like that. Local storage, that was their own. They wanted to play around with local storage a little bit, so they kind of just put that in there as their own test. There are some things they want to do there in terms of articles and being able to save for later and things like that. But theirs basically translates to something like this. On the core experience, that most read tab, which you might not be able to see in the back, and I apologize for that. But you have 2 tabs, top stories and most read. And the most read is an actual link to a most read page. On the enhanced experience, they actually pull that in so that you get this tab display and you can tab between the 2. That's a very simple example of what they're doing on that kind of situation. I also feel like I should explain why Natalie Portman's in the top right corner of that. This is from a presentation given by Tom Maslin from the BBC, and he explained their approach to this as inviting browsers to a party. And you have some browsers that are cool, the like David Hasselhoff or whatever. I can't remember his exact examples. I don't know. He's not cool, but I think it might have made his cut. And then what's that? Yeah, in Germany he is, right? So maybe right, he's a big deal there, I guess. And then you have other browsers that aren't so cool, like Cartman dressed up as Hitler, I think was one of the examples. I think he was IE6 or something like that. And so you invite them all to a party, but when you're at, and everybody's at the party and they're having a good time, and then you have the enhanced experience of the site, which was Natalie Portman, and you don't want certain browsers. You don't want Eric Cartman as Hitler interacting with Natalie Portman and whatever. So that was basically his thing. It was a lot funnier when he did it. He had about 20 different cast of characters. But anyway, usually there's somebody who asks after, why was Natalie Portman sitting there? So that's why. Very good deck, by the way. The link is at the bottom when the slides are up. I definitely recommend it. The BBC has been doing some brilliant things with their responsive approach, and they've got a lot of good information there. Now, the Boston Globe does something. They didn't call it cutting the mustard, but it's something very similar. They found out that media queries being supported kind of related to what they wanted to do. So I guess they broke it down as if media queries are supported, so if you're Awesome or your Internet Explorer, where the way that they presented it, you get the enhanced version. I should say the older version of Internet Explorer. The new versions are actually quite nice. But this was their way of cutting the mustard, so they pull in the enhanced experience. So an example of what they did is their weather widget. The initial state, the core state, is just very simple, the temperature and things like that, and it links off to your weather page. The Ajax enhanced state brings on all this additional information if you actually interact with it. So this was another way that they kept that core experience light. So what this does is it extends your reach because you're hitting devices that might have choked on this before, and it gets that initial core experience to be as light as possible so that core experience can be experienced by more devices, which is very, very valuable. A simple way of implementing this, it's a very simple thing to do. This is from the site from my book. The contributions and the reviews are actually on the small screen. They're links. They're not actually being pulled in by default. The contributions were, there was like 10 people who contributed, so there were images that I didn't want to necessarily download. And the reviews, because obviously there was going to be thousands and thousands of possible reviews, and I didn't want that taking up screen real estate either. I think there's 5. No, there's more than 5, but it's not 1,000s. So the idea being that nothing kicks in on default. So what happens is they're basically a link that goes off to the page that contains that information. Then using a script, you use this basic anchor include pattern, which is just kind of get these elements that exist there with these sources and make an AJAX request. I'm using request as like an AJAX helper. It can be whatever you want or just the dynamic, the normal. Actually go out, grab that information from the target and bring it back in. What happens is on larger screens, this happens right after that initial load. So right after, or I guess right before the initial load, I think I actually make the request to pull those in so that when when the site's viewed on a large screen, those images are there and those reviews are there. On the small screen, you can do anything, really. You can have this link off to static pages. You can pull it in on click. It depends, again, a little bit on how much that's going to be used in terms of balancing that with the radio connection. There's actually a jQuery plugin created by the Filament Group that handles this, and it's far more advanced than my little snippet that I just showed you. They have the ability to replace content, append to content, put before content, put after content. and you just call it something like this. It's very lightweight. The filament group is another great resource to pay attention to if you care about responsive design and performance. They work on big sites, and they share all of their solutions right on their GitHub repo. Everything's just sitting there.
What's the name of that group?
Filament group. Filament group. I think, and I haven't proved it yet, but my suspicion is that they also just kind of sit around in their office and look for things that are broken on the internet that they can fix. Because every time that I'm looking for, like, oh, I wonder if anybody's made a lightweight polyfill for something, they have it. So I wonder sometimes that I don't know how they produce the client work in addition to like multitudes of fixing every problem. Scott Gell, one of their developers, created the picture polyfill while floating down a boat on a river in Cambodia or something like that, which is kind of absurd. I couldn't do that for my hotel room in more than 3 days. But he did it in like an hour on a boat. Yeah. So this is one of the ways you can kind of handle this. And if you don't want to make this AJAX request, you can actually just comment out that HTML that sits inside of there. So this is another way you could do that. You could have a div with the information, like the paragraph and the image or whatever you might have in there that you may not load on these small screens, and just comment it out. And then in this case, the lazy content could specify where the container would, maybe where you would put that. The ARA live is for an accessibility enhancement because you're going to be dynamically inserting content in there potentially. So ARA live says to politely inform the person using a screen reader that new contents become available on the page. And it just basically, you just grab the containers with that lazy content. You go through the children element, find the comments, uncomment it out, and that stuff comes in. That, again, decreases that initial weight. And on the small screens or whatever screen it might be that you're not actually going to be displaying that content, you don't actually have to hit the downloads or anything like that. So what about the actual CSS? So there's two ways of primarily handling media queries with CSS. You can do it embedded, so within the same style sheet, and have all your media queries sitting throughout there. It's very common. Or external, so you actually put the media attribute on an external link and pull in the styles based on how the media query evaluates. Now there's pros and cons to both. That's kind of a recurring theme in this presentation. So in embedded, you get the one HTTP request. External, you get several, right? So that's something to keep in mind. With the embedded, you could get this large file that might be hard to maintain. And this might be small for the back. I apologize. External organization could be easier because everything's kind of grouped out by its own screen size. You can get around most of that if you're using any sort of compiler like Less or SAS or anything like that. You can have it organized however you want, so that may not even be an issue for you. For embedded, you get this extra weight regardless of whether or not it's needed because everything's sitting in one style sheet. For external, you can actually optimize the initial core experience CSS so that it's much smaller for devices that don't support media queries. So you can actually keep that weight low for them. All styles download, and this is regardless of if it's embedded or external. And this is like one of the benefits that at first people were like, well, I'm going to go external because then the browser's not going to grab all these unnecessarily style sheets. But it grabs it anyway. Scott Gell ran a test with all of these different media queries, including media query nonsense, and ran it across these different browsers and found out that everybody downloaded these things, whether or not they were needed on these devices. Except for, you can see Opera 11 was smart enough to at least tell that nonsense wasn't something that mattered. There's a decent reason for this, though. They don't know necessarily what the device is going to, like what you're going to do with it. You could change orientation, now all of a sudden you need new styles. Maybe you hook that up to some sort of external display or a projector or something like that. There's any number of different scenarios where they might need those additional styles to actually kick in and be there. So it actually makes sense from some perspective. But it just means that there is no way around avoiding these downloads. So even if you do something like this, it's going to come in anyway. There's just, you can't avoid those extra downloads. But the browsers are working with this. They're trying to figure out, okay, so if it's inapplicable, maybe we can deprioritize it. Maybe we can actually bring that stuff in further down the chain so that it's not, we're kind of speeding up that critical rendering path. This works on some browsers. Like these guys, if they see a media query that doesn't apply to that screen, they'll deprioritize it so it no longer blocks that rendering path, so you can get things onto the screen as quickly as possible. But on a lot of other browsers, you're actually, what it does is it'll block, and it'll sit on that style sheet the entire time until it's loaded. So potentially that's a benefit of external. Potentially the browsers could optimize for that critical path. This is where it kind of depends on a lot about what you're supporting and what your process is and stuff, because I think very shortly we're going to be making the case that you're going to want those things external, because you're going to want the browser to be able to like optimize what gets sent that's actually going to be needed at the moment and deprioritize everything else. The problem is right now, because so many browsers aren't doing it, that you have that trade-off that you have to make. You have to accept that a large percentage of the people accessing your site, potentially extremely large, are going to get this decreased experience from having all sorts of external CSS sitting up there. I think soon that's going to be best practice, is going to be external. At the moment, I don't know that I would dictate it.
So if you're using an external style and those requests are actually being made, does the browser still parse that CSS and just do nothing with it, or does it download and then not?
No, I mean, it downloads, and I think it parses. I guess I haven't really tested to see if it's parsing the whole thing. I know it's just sitting there. Like what he did on this test, no, I was there. This test. What he actually did on this test is he sat on the style sheet and he had that be a delayed delivery. So I think it was, he set up to some absurd amount of seconds. And it just sat there. So the browsers would sit there spinning as they were waiting for the CSS to come into play. Nothing else was happening. It was just sitting there stalled until the CSS kicked in. So, yeah, I don't know if that helps at all with what you were just asking, but I think it's parsing it and just not applying is my guess, but I haven't tested it, so I could not tell you for sure.
Do any of the polyfills do a better job of, say, eventing the external sheets on a screen size change event?
Yeah, do any of the polyfills do a better job of eventing the style sheets? There's actually, so the filament group created something called ECS Essential. It's very hard to pronounce, but when you see it written out, it actually makes sense. That is a JavaScript tool that basically would do that. What the deal was, and this is why they did this test as well, because they were getting a little feedback saying that maybe this wasn't a good idea. They were using this tool. So they wanted to see how often this enhancement happened. But ECS Essential basically does that. It analyzes the styles. You set like a style and a breakpoint, and it determines what needs to be downloaded right away. And the rest of the stuff it just sits on until everything else is loaded. And then it either brings it in at that point, or I think you can actually tell it to not bring it in until they're actually needed, like the orientation changes or whatever it is. The performance gains, though, have been contested. It seems like from my tests that anytime I've noticed any sort of difference, it's been very minor. And I think with more and more browsers kind of kicking to this, I personally think that ECS Essential is probably not. I don't know that I would try to polyfill around it. I think this is one of those scenarios where I would let the browser and the enhancements that they're making kind of deal with it, because again, from my tests, the gains haven't been good enough to justify it. Your mileage may vary. Maybe there's a different scenario, but in my case, I haven't noticed anything where I'd want to use that. Yes, did you see a hand? No. Okay, I'm just getting a little jumpy. So now we get to the part of the presentation where I get scared. Go vanilla. So this is about JavaScript and whether or not you should use frameworks, and this is where people start to get a little upset at me sometimes. This is why it's towards the end of the session. PPK at a conference basically said, you know what, forget about current JavaScript libraries because they're all too heavy for mobile. And there is a lot of stir, a lot of ruckus over this. But there's also some truth in this. So jQuery, we're going to pick on jQuery because jQuery is the most common by far. Stoyan Stefanov did some tests where he was seeing how long it took just to parse it on iPhone, Android devices. And this was based on jQuery 1.8, and it was taking between 200 and 300 milliseconds just to parse jQuery on an iPhone. And the iPhone is not, in case anybody was wondering, it's not a low-end device. This is going to be much quicker than what you're going to get on some of those, Android 2.x or some of the older BlackBerries or anything like that. So there's a little bit of a hit here for having this JavaScript sitting there inside of this library because of the size of it. In fact, Maximiliano Furtman, in one of his workshops somewhere, once said that, you know what, he was finding on some BlackBerries it was taking up to 8 seconds to get through this. Now this was, I think this is probably 1.6, 1.5 or something like that. This is an even older version of jQuery. I worked on a project where we had to hit devices that were running BlackBerry 5, devices that were running like NetFront, really painful things. Loading jQuery on the page killed the browser. Like, we literally killed it. We'd get a little message. These were low-powered smartphones, and they said, it just blew the memory up. Because we were like, what on earth is causing this? It wasn't smart enough to tell us what it was. And we found out that just by getting rid of jQuery, it was good to go. This does not, I don't mean don't ever use jQuery. I use jQuery on a lot of projects. I like jQuery for quite a bit. I like a lot of frameworks for quite a few reasons. There's maintenance reasons. There's the fact that they've been fully vetted and tested, at least if it's a good framework. There's the community that comes around it in terms of the plugins and stuff like that. But I think we just need to be smart with it. We need to be careful with it. If you're going to be bringing this stuff in, like jQuery or something like that, try to do like the custom builds. Only pull in what you're actually going to need. Don't just necessarily have the full thing sitting there. We gain a lot by using frameworks, but we also lose things. Like I've been saying, everything has a trade-off. And a lot of the stuff that you're doing in frameworks probably is, you can't see in the back, but a lot of the stuff that you're doing in frameworks doesn't take that much code of vanilla JavaScript to get the same thing done, even in a cross-browser manner. So just make sure that you're kind of watching that. And every time that you're looking about adding a framework or reaching for another plugin or reaching for another library, make sure that you're analyzing what value is that providing. Like, what are you giving up for it, and what are you getting in exchange? Because it's not free. There's no free lunch here. And then just one little segue. At one conference, somebody tweeted something to the extent, I think on the stage, they were talking about JavaScript libraries, and I think they were probably doing the Zepto jQuery debate, because that happens a lot. And they, so he tweeted, instead of worrying about JavaScript library size, just include one less image on your page. Which, all right, there's some truth in that. What the point he was making was that they were really kind of focusing on this when there were bigger fish to fry. But unfortunately, as tweets tend to happen with 140 characters, go figure, people kind of took it in a different way. And so now there's blog posts around this where people are like, well, I don't worry about jQuery versus anything else because I don't have to. I'll just not include an image. It's like they're using that as an excuse to not have to think about the library discussion at all. Worry about it and include one less image. I mean, get a step ahead of everybody else. I mean, do both. Don't necessarily use one as the excuse not to optimize for the other. It's all about smart defaults. I think right now we tend on a lot of boilerplates, on a lot of the things that you'll be using. All of this stuff comes in by default. All these libraries get included, all these fixes get included, and half the time we don't know what these things are sitting there for. Half the time we don't know if we're actually going to need them. They're just there in case. And so we end up with these extra bloat and this extra weight that may not actually need to be there at all. I'd like to see us get to a smarter default place where our default starting point is simple, and then we have like a core set of things that we turn to when we need it. If we need jQuery, we know it's there and we know it's fully tested, we can pull it in at that point. If we need this plugin, we know that this is there and this is tested and we can pull it in, but not having it there just in case, I think that's a big risk and a big issue with a lot of projects. So smarter defaults. Yeah.
I'm aware of many tools with closure compiler that would optimize the way the code that is not actually utility.
So the jQuery, anything like closure compiler that optimizes the unused stuff. So actually the jQuery, what is it? 2.0 actually is modular, right? 2.0 is the one that they made at that version change. That custom build tool as well could do something like that. There are things that you can incorporate. There's some grunt modules that'll do that, that'll look through what's actually being used, and then if it's a modular library, they'll make the decision to kind of keep that stuff out. So there are things out there. I think Clojure is probably one of the better ones that I've tried for that. Maybe other people have other personal preferences, but there's other things available, but Clojure I think is kind of the, at least in my experience, the one that does the best job. Has anybody else got anything on the? Nobody wants to throw anything at me for just decrying. That's good. And again, I just want to say I'm not being an absolutist here. Like, there are times to use a framework. Okay? There's benefits of it, and just make the decision carefully. And since we have 15 minutes, I can get into one more that tends to be somewhat controversial at times. REST, responsive design plus server-side enhancements. That's right, we're going to talk about the server side. Oh, I don't have audio. No, hold on 1 second. We're going to do this again. It loses its impact. No, there we go. We're going to talk about the server side. See, that was supposed to kick in, be really loud. Can anybody hear that? It's the all right. Man, completely wasted. This part gets, there's a lot of people in the responsive community in particular that have this really like adverse reaction to this stuff. But here's the thing, right? Responsive design and making it fast, it isn't easy. It isn't something we can just, there's a reason why we have more sites that are fat than more sites that are not. It's because it's difficult. So I don't think we should discount any tools that might be able to help us along the way. And so you hear a lot of this UA detection is evil thing. This is what you hear this from a lot of people. And a lot of people will try to promote like feature detection. Always use feature detection instead of UA detection. But the problem with that is that browsers are like fishermen. They kind of lie and exaggerate. So what might pass a feature detect like their level of support may not actually be to the point where you want it. It's like some cases they'll support a certain property, but they'll perform horrendously with that property in place, or they'll only have partial support. I like this. This is a Stack Overflow thing where somebody asked a question about how to detect for something, and he's like, you know what? The most reliable way would be to not do the browser sniffing because it's fragile. Do this feature detect here. Here's this script I wrote, and I like it because he's like, browser sniffing is so fragile and unreliable. And then somebody points out, your test returns a false positive in mobile Safari. So his is higher than thou feature detect also had issues there. And in addition, there are devices like the BlackBerry where they return false positives on Modernizer Touch for certain BlackBerry devices. So feature detect isn't foolproof either. And this gets back to the same blame the implementation, not the technique. I think when we think about user agent detection, we tend to picture scenarios like this where people are telling us, you know what, you need to open this on a laptop or desktop browser, and then once you open it on your computer, you have a QR code that you can then scan to go to the URL on your phone. I mean, that's the way that's what we tend to think of in terms of user agent detection, that it's going to be these segmented experiences where we're excluding people. The reality is 82% of the Alexa Top 100 sites use some sort of feature or server-side detection. Most of the time, we have no idea that happens. There are ways to do it responsibly. Just the other day, Ronan Kremen, who was the guy in charge of Device Atlas, which is one of the better commercial products available for this, wrote something for Smashing Magazine where he kind of demoed how responsive design could work in tandem with server-side. Basically, he's using his Device Atlas client. I'll just walk through kind of quickly. And he's getting the device data, so that's just this list of all these properties about the device. And he stores it in an array. And in this case, he can grab the width or something like that. Now, in his demo, what he's doing is he's pairing that with page speed, where you have this optimization available in the page speed thing, where if the width is sitting there, an explicit width, it can actually resize the image to be the correct size. So he's comboing up the two approaches, just spitting the width in a width attribute, and then the page speed module kicks in and resizes everything, and you get this big benefit in terms of page weight. He then went on to show another example where he could take Device Atlas has this ability to be able to do a little bit of network performance testing. It's a pretty crude way. I think he's just kind of basically pinging some stuff out there and testing what the average response is. But with something like that, he's able to, in his scenario, go between a low and a high quality site. So the low quality site might be something that's super simplified and stripped down. You could also do this on a more granular level for simple requests and things like that. The examples I like to use from like Wurfel, which is another one that's available. It's technically not always commercial, but you're probably never going to use the non-commercial, like the free version, because you have to have your code basically available online and stuff like that, which most companies is a no deal. So you're probably going to pay for it if you use it. But in this case, you can kind of get the device capability if it has a cellular radio connection. Does it support the make a phone call string? Then we know it's a wireless device. And then find out how it supports that make a phone call string, because that changes depending on some of the older devices handled it in a different way than some of the newer ones. If it does not support the make a phone call string, then we're going to say it's a wireless false, wireless false. Now, the way you would use this is you wouldn't exclude anybody from the experience. The fallback would be completely usable. What you would do is if you can detect that you can guarantee that that's a wireless device that supports the make a phone call string, then you can optimize and enhance that experience for them. The idea is that you're not excluding anybody from what you're getting. You're just making the experience better where you can. It comes down to knowing what that core experience, that essential experience needs to be, and then optimizing when you can, instead of making necessary assumptions. And you can pair this with feature detect. Basically, you can take and just set like a cookie here. We're going to kind of go through this quickly because we're winding down of time. But basically, you can create a cookie, grab like feature tests and stuff, and store it into the cookie, and then pair that up on the server side and get access to this information and pull those properties out. So things that are going to be better served by feature detect, pair it with the server side detection. Stephanie, who I mentioned earlier, Stephanie and Brian Rieger, they do stuff like this in conjunction with information that they learn through testing. So they'll have, for a device that hits their site, they'll analyze both a series of feature detects, a series of server-side detection information, as well as information they find. Like, let's say that they find that on this particular browser, drop shadows are horrendous. They add that little bit of nugget somehow into that information so that the profile of the device returns not just what the device is telling them, but what they've learned from testing. And so they build up this incredible knowledge base anytime that that site gets, that device hits the site. Going forward, we can actually ditch the UA detection entirely pretty soon. I think Chrome is, at least the latest builds of Chromium have this enabled behind flags, but this idea of client hints, which would be another header that would get passed down. So in its form like this, you'd have client hints DPR, device pixel ratio, 2.0, which says this is what the server sends back to the browser. The browser you now know that this is a 2.0 Retina display, and you can do something with that. And you can do client hits for width and height and whatever other properties. At the moment, I think this is the only one that Chromium actually has supported in the build. But this would be even more reliable than UA detection because you wouldn't have to deal about the whole future-friendly updating your device databases, which honestly most of the commercial products do and do it very quickly. You'll never even notice. But this is a way that would be a little bit more friendly going forward, and this is coming down the pipe soon. So there are things we can do from the server side to improve performance. You can obviously tailor things before they get sent down the pipe, which is a big deal. So don't necessarily discount it just because we've seen it abused so many times. There are legitimate cases for it, and there are actual ways that you can use it, almost in a progressive enhancement kind of way. So basically, and we know this in this room, but it's time to move beyond the visual aesthetics side of thing. And this is where responsive design has been so far. It's been the primary discussion. It's where a lot of companies still stick. They want it because it's a buzzword. They want it because of all these other reasons. But there's so much more value in it in terms of what it hits for reach. And there's so many ways that we can hit it in terms that we don't cripple the performance of a site. When you do something like this, when you optimize a responsive site for performance, talk about it because not enough people are talking about it. Just this morning, while another presentation was going on, Entertainment Weekly launched a responsive site. 3 of the designers on the project all wrote big, long blog posts about their design process, and they're fantastic. They went through all of this stuff. It's an incredible resource. People are eating these things up because they want to hear how other people are dealing with it. But you almost never see that discussion from the performance side of things. So if one of you guys are doing that, if somebody does a responsive site and you've got a cool solution, talk about it. Share it in a post, share it in a presentation at a meetup, or whatever you got to do. Just get the word out and help other people figure this out and find out that you can do responsive in a performance way. It's not necessarily easy. Responsive by its nature means different devices, different browsers, different input types, different networks. We don't get the luxury of being able to say we're optimizing for a specific platform anymore. We have to know the whole gamut and what the trade-offs are all the way up and down the spectrum. But to me, that's what's awesome about the web. That's what gets me excited, that we can build things that can go anywhere, to any device and any browser. To me, that's incredibly awesome and a lot of fun. Thanks. I think I got 5 minutes. If anybody's got any questions, or if anybody wants to voice their jQuery complaints now, yes.
Do you think those original stats you showed with the growing sites for mobile, like in a year or two from now, will be real different? Because everyone's moving to the mobile first type framework.
I would like to think that it'll be different.
I mean, just by default, like the original Twitter bootstrap or 2.x, that wasn't mobile first. That's what people are using. They're going to get that desktop full site.
It's certainly going to take, by the frameworks and stuff moving to that mobile first and people moving to that mobile first development perspective, it's certainly going to help, but it's certainly going to take us part of the way. I mean, there's always going to be things we're going to have to do in addition to that, but it's an awesome start. Yes?
Have you seen any more complicated sites, like e-commerce sites, that are maybe trying to optimize it for responsive rather than just saying new sites and content?
Any e-commerce sites? So I've seen e-commerce sites, depending of various sizes, like O'Neill Clothing. I think Skinny Ties is a smaller thing. Both of them have blogged about their responsive process a little bit and what they got in terms of metrics in the end. There are companies looking at it. There are companies working on it kind of behind the scenes that they're not quite publicly announcing it yet. It's coming. I think it was slow to get there because of where responsive started from that content focus. I think it was also because I just talked to a major e-commerce company the other week, and they were trying to fledge out whether or not this is something they want to do because they were kind of worried about the performance stuff, but it sounds like they're going to move in that direction. So I think that the examples are coming. I think the reason why we haven't seen so many is because, yeah, it's not necessarily easy to do. But honestly, at this point, because of just how diverse things have gotten from a device perspective, I don't know that I could justify building a site that didn't have at least some responsive elements to it. Because I think that anytime you do that now, I think the shelf life for that is becoming, shortly, will soon become limited, obsolete quickly. I think that everything has to have a little bit of that responsiveness to it, even if it's a separate thing for now. So I guess long answer to the question, but I think it's coming. And there are sites that are working on it. It's just a matter of who's going to get it out and then talk about it first. And there are a couple. Like I said, O'Neill and Skinny Ties are both e-commerce things that you can kind of check out. To some degree, they've had some performance stuff in there. Not as optimized as they perhaps could be.
What are you feeling with Twitter Bootstrap to help with responsive?
What do I feel about Bootstrap? I like that they're going mobile first now. Like they're making that shift. It's a big deal. I think Bootstrap has a lot of value when used in the right scenarios. I think it goes back to my smart default thing. I think that any sort of, like my default, for example, is to use no framework. And it's not because I have this adverse, opinion of frameworks in general. It's just because there's often a lot of overhead that can come with those. And if you're not careful about what that is, and if you don't know where they're applying that overhead, it can be tricky to kind of get around that. I don't not like it. Like I said, I think in the right situation, I think it's good. It's just like any tool, though. It's got to be used appropriately. And just be aware of, like really get to know it, because there are decisions. Anytime there's any framework, there's always going to be a couple decisions that maybe don't actually make the most sense. I heard rumblings from somebody that there might have been a lot of pixel-based sizes, and I don't know if you can, pixel-based sizes being used and stuff like that, measurements inside of Bootstrap, which actually isn't a best practice in terms of responsive, but it's there. So if you're not aware that those decisions are being made, sometimes some of those things you'll get missed.
You mean for the grid or for their responsibility?
I heard I think the person who brought it up was actually referring to the fonts or the grids or something like that. I have to dig into it deeper to find out what it is. But yeah, I mean, now at this point, you should be using relative units for that and the media queries probably as well. So if they're not, that's just something to be aware of. But yeah, there's value in them if used appropriately. I saw another hand in the back, I think. No? Last one? Okay, right here.
Have you tested the difference between using sprites instead of icon fonts?
Sprites versus icon fonts. Icon fonts, my biggest issue with icon fonts at the moment is just the fallback isn't there very well. Opera Mini, which is massively popular, although underreported in a lot of analytics, but massively popular worldwide, has a lot of issues with icon fonts. The value in terms of because it's a font and the scalability and stuff like that, there's hopefully it's a nut we can crack. But at the moment, I tend not to use them overly just because of that perspective. Potentially. I mean, it always depends on who you're targeting and what your audience is and stuff like that. And there are ways to do a responsible fallback. It's just not necessarily inherent with the technique. It's definitely some workarounds there. But there's value in it because it's the same thing as SVG. Like a font's going to scale for those different resolutions and sizes very well. So it's something we need to experiment with and find the best way of doing it and then get that in place. It's a great technique for that. Okay, yeah, so I think I saw one or two other hands. I'll be here the entire time, the next few days too, so either come up now or after and we can chat more. Thanks, guys.